So you think you know politics? You think your country's political scene is a reality show? Ah, my friends, welcome. Pull up a chair. Today we're diving headfirst into the wild, unpredictable, and often unbelievable world of South African politics. I'm T, and we are about to count down the top 10 moments that didn't just make headlines. They grabbed the entire nation by the shoulders and shook it. These aren't just your standard political gaffes or boring policy debates. No. We're talking about moments so shocking, so dramatic, they could give any season of Game of Thrones a run for its money, except this is all real, and the stakes are infinitely higher. From prison gates swinging open to presidential palaces being emptied under duress, we're going to explore the events that left South Africans speechless and the world watching in disbelief. These moments are more than just historical footnotes, they are seismic shifts that have fundamentally altered the course of the nation. They've tested the country's democracy, exposed its deepest wounds, and showcased its incredible, often bewildering resilience. It's a story of tragedy and triumph, of heroes and villains, and sometimes it's really hard to tell which is which. It's a journey that will make you laugh, cry, and probably shout at your screen. So, get ready for a deep dive into the heart of the Rainbow Nation's political drama. We're going to unpack the scandals, the standoffs, and the speeches that have defined modern South Africa. This isn't just a history lesson, it's a look at the very soul of a country forged in fire, a nation constantly grappling with its past while trying to build a future. These are the top 10 most jaw-dropping moments in South African political history. And trust me, you're going to want to stick around for this. Let's get into it. Alright, let's kick things off at number 10. And we're starting with a moment that wasn't just shocking in a bad way, but shocking in its sheer, world-altering magnitude. February 11th, 1990. For many South Africans and people around the globe, Nelson Mandela was more of a myth than a man. He was a symbol, an idea, a name whispered in defiance of a brutal apartheid regime that had tried to erase him from history. For 27 long years, he was locked away on Robben Island and other prisons, a political prisoner who the government hoped the world would simply forget. But the world didn't forget. The Free Nelson Mandela movement became a global rallying cry. People who couldn't even point to South Africa on a map knew his name. They knew what he stood for. So when President F.W. de Klerk stood before Parliament and announced that Mandela would be released unconditionally, the world held its breath. Could it be real? After decades of brutal oppression, was the regime finally, truly cracking? It seemed too good to be true, a fantasy that activists had dreamed of for so long. Then the day came. The cameras were rolling, the crowds were gathered outside Victor Verster prison, a sea of expectant faces. And then, he appeared, walking through those gates, hand in hand with Winnie, fist raised in the air. It was a sight that sent shockwaves across the planet. This man, this symbol, was flesh and blood. He was free. The image of him taking those first steps as a free man is etched into the collective memory of the world. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated hope. The shock wasn't just about one man's freedom, it was about what his freedom represented. It was the beginning of the end for apartheid. It was the sound of the death knell for a system built on racial hatred. For Black South Africans, it was a moment of incredible vindication and joy, a sign that their long, painful struggle was not in vain. The celebrations that erupted across the country were something to behold, a spontaneous outpouring of emotion that had been suppressed for generations. But for the white minority government and its supporters, it was a moment of deep uncertainty and fear. The man they had branded a terrorist was now the most powerful figure in the country, and nobody knew what would happen next. Would there be retribution? A civil war? The air was thick with tension and possibility. This single event, this walk to freedom, didn't just change South Africa. It set the entire nation on a completely new, terrifying, and exhilarating path. It was the ultimate political game changer. From a moment of incredible hope to one of, well, let's call it national exasperation. Fast forward a few decades to number 9, the resignation of President Jacob Zuma in 2018. If Mandela's release was a slow-burn epic, Zuma's departure was a high-stakes political thriller that played out in real time on our television screens. For years, his presidency had been bogged down by one scandal after another. We're talking corruption allegations, court battles, and that whole Nkandla fire pool saga. Don't worry, we'll get to that. The pressure had been building for years, not just from opposition parties but from within his own party, the ANC. It was like watching a family dinner where everyone knows Uncle Jacob has had too much sherry, but no one wants to be the one to take his keys. The party was deeply divided. On one side you had Zuma's loyalists, and on the other, you had a growing faction led by Cyril Ramaphosa, who believed Zuma was damaging the party and the country beyond repair. The tension was palpable. The final days were pure political theater. The ANC's top leadership, the National Executive Committee, held marathon meetings trying to convince Zuma to step down gracefully. They recalled him, which is the party's polite way of saying, "You're fired. Please leave before we have to call security." But Zuma, ever the political survivor, dug in his heels. He went on national television for a rambling, defiant interview basically asking, "What have I done wrong?" while the entire country face-palmed in unison. It was a standoff. The president of the country versus his own party. The nation was glued to the news, wondering if he would be impeached, if he would refuse to leave, if the military would have to get involved. It was a constitutional crisis in the making. The whole situation was dripping with irony. The ANC, the Party of Liberation, was now struggling to remove a leader who many felt had betrayed the very principles they fought for. The drama was intense, a political soap opera of the highest order. Finally, late on the night of February 14, 2018, Valentine's Day of all days, Zuma addressed the nation. He announced his resignation, effective immediately. But he didn't go quietly. He spent most of the speech complaining about how unfairly he'd been treated. There was no apology, no contrition, just defiance to the very end. The nation breathed a collective sigh of relief. The immediate reaction was jubilation in many quarters. The RAN strengthened, people celebrated in the streets. It was the end of an era, a truly shocking and dramatic conclusion to one of the most tumultuous presidencies in South Africa's democratic history. Now we move to a moment that is shocking for an entirely different and much darker reason. Number 8 is the Marikana Massacre. This one is tough. On August 16, 2012, the South African Police Service opened fire on a group of striking mine workers at a platinum mine in Marikana, Northwest Province. In the space of a few minutes, 34 miners were killed, and many more were injured. It was a brutal, bloody event that was broadcast on national television, and it seared itself into the nation's conscience. The context is crucial. These miners were on strike for better wages. They were demanding a basic salary of 12,500 rand a month, a figure that seemed astronomical to the mining company, Lonmin, but was a lifeline for the workers. Tensions had been escalating for days. There had been violence, intimidation, and several deaths in the lead-up to the 16th, including 2 police officers and 2 security guards. The atmosphere was incredibly volatile. The striking miners had gathered on a small hill, a kopje, armed with traditional weapons like spears and pangas, a show of defiance. What happened next is still fiercely debated, but the outcome is tragically clear. The police, armed with automatic rifles, moved in to disperse the crowd. The official narrative was that they fired in self-defense after being attacked, but video footage and subsequent investigations told a much more complicated and horrifying story. Many of the miners were shot in the back as they fled. Some were hunted down and killed far from the main confrontation. It was a scene of utter chaos and carnage. The shock was immediate and profound. This wasn't the apartheid police force of the old regime. This was the police service of a democratic South Africa, gunning down its own citizens. The images were hauntingly similar to those from the Sharpeville massacre of 1960. The country reeled. How could this happen in the new South Africa? The nation that was supposed to be a beacon of peaceful resolution and human rights had just witnessed a state-sanctioned massacre. It felt like a betrayal of everything the democratic project stood for. The aftermath was a painful reckoning. The Farlam Commission of Inquiry was set up to investigate, and it revealed a horrifying chain of command failures, poor police planning, and a complete breakdown of trust between the company, the state, and the workers. The Marikana Massacre left a deep, unhealed wound on the soul of the nation. It exposed the brutal realities of inequality that still persisted long after apartheid had ended, and served as a shocking reminder that the struggle for social and economic justice was far from over. Coming in at number 7 is a scandal so vast, so pervasive, it got its own name: state capture. This wasn't just one shocking moment, but a slow, creeping horror story that unfolded over several years. Imagine, if you will, a termite infestation. But instead of eating away at the wood in your house, it's eating away at the very foundations of the state. That's state capture. It refers to a specific type of systemic political corruption where private interests significantly influence a state's decision-making processes to their own advantage. At the heart of this scandal were the Guptas, a wealthy family of Indian-born businessmen with incredibly close ties to then-President Jacob Zuma and his family. The allegations were, honestly, breathtaking in their audacity. The Guptas were accused of influencing the appointment of cabinet ministers, essentially hand-picking people who would run government departments in a way that would benefit their vast business empire. They weren't just lobbying, they were allegedly pulling the strings of government itself. The story broke into the mainstream, thanks to brave whistleblowers and incredible investigative journalism. A series of leaked emails known as the Gupta leaks provided a treasure trove of evidence. They detailed how the family allegedly siphoned off billions of rands from state-owned enterprises like Eskom, the power utility, and Transnet, the rail and ports authority. They were accused of landing lucrative government contracts, arranging cushy jobs for allies, and even having a say in who became a minister. The Minister of Finance, it was alleged, was offered his job by the Guptas before the president even called him. The public outrage was immense. This wasn't just about politicians being corrupt for their own gain. This was about the alleged auctioning off of the country's sovereignty to the highest bidder. It explained so much that was going wrong in the country. The failing state-owned companies, the crumbling infrastructure, the sense that the government wasn't working for the people. It felt like a hostile takeover of the democratic state, orchestrated from the shadows with the complicity of the highest office in the land. The fallout led to the Zondo Commission of Inquiry into allegations of state capture, a massive multi-year investigation that heard testimony from hundreds of witnesses. The daily revelations were a constant source of shock and anger for South Africans, laying bare the sheer scale of the rot. State capture became the defining scandal of the Zuma era, a shocking exposé of how deep corruption could run and how vulnerable a young democracy could be to being hollowed out from the inside. We're going back to the early 90s for number 6, to a moment that brought South Africa to the absolute brink of civil war. The assassination of Chris Hani on April 10, 1993. At the time, Hani was one of the most popular and influential leaders in the country. He was the leader of the South African Communist Party and a senior figure in the ANC's armed wing, Umkhonto we Sizwe. To many young radical black South Africans, he was a hero, a charismatic firebrand who they trusted more than anyone else. The country was in a delicate, fragile state. Negotiations to end apartheid and transition to a democracy were underway, but they were fraught with tension. Violence between different political factions was rampant. The far right was vehemently opposed to the handover of power. It was a political powder keg, and Chris Hani's murder was the match that lit the fuse. He was gunned down in the driveway of his home in Boksburg, a racially mixed suburb, by a white far-right extremist named Janusz Wallace. The news of his death spread like wildfire. The nation was plunged into shock, which quickly turned to incandescent rage. Hani's supporters, feeling that their hero had been stolen from them just as freedom was in sight, poured into the streets. Riots erupted across the country. The sense of betrayal was immense. It felt like a deliberate attempt by extremist forces to derail the entire peace process and drag the country into a racial war, and it almost worked. This is where Nelson Mandela, not yet president but the undisputed leader of the nation, stepped up in a way that arguably saved the country. The government of F.W. de Klerk seemed paralyzed. Mandela went on national television and made a direct appeal to the nation for calm. It was a remarkable speech. He spoke not as a partisan leader, but as a father to a grieving, angry nation. He acknowledged the pain and anger but pleaded with South Africans, black and white, not to let the assassins win by destroying the country. His calm, authoritative presence managed to pull the country back from the abyss. It was a pivotal moment that demonstrated his incredible leadership and moral authority. The assassination of Chris Hani was a profound national trauma, a shocking act of political violence that threatened to undo everything. But in a strange way, the shared horror and the way the nation collectively stepped back from the edge may have solidified the resolve of many to see the peaceful transition through, no matter the cost. It was a terrible, shocking loss that paradoxically underscored the absolute necessity of a democratic future. At number 5, we have a scandal that has haunted South African politics for decades. a story of alleged bribery and corruption that reaches the highest levels of government. I'm talking about the arms deal. Officially known as the Strategic Defense Package, this was a massive arms procurement deal finalized in 1999. The newly democratic South Africa decided it needed to upgrade its military hardware and went on a shopping spree, signing contracts worth around 30 billion rand, a staggering amount at the time, for new fighter jets, helicopters, and naval vessels from European arms companies. From the very beginning, the deal was controversial. Many critics asked why a country with so many pressing social needs, like housing, education, and healthcare, was spending a fortune on military equipment. Who was South Africa planning to fight? It seemed like a bizarre set of priorities for a developing nation at peace. But the government, led by then-President Thabo Mbeki, defended it as essential for modernizing the defense force and for peacekeeping missions on the continent. The real shock came later with allegations of widespread corruption. It was claimed that the contracts were secured through massive bribes paid to senior politicians and officials. The numbers being thrown around were insane. Millions of dollars allegedly changing hands to influence the decision-making process. The scandal implicated some of the biggest names in the ANC, casting a dark shadow over the party that had been hailed as a moral beacon just a few years earlier. This scandal was a slow-motion car crash. It led to investigations, cover-ups, and the downfall of several powerful figures. Jacob Zuma, who was the deputy president at the time, was directly implicated when his financial advisor, Schabir Shaik, was convicted of corruption for trying to solicit a bribe for Zuma from an arms company. This conviction led to Mbeki firing Zuma as his deputy, a move that would set in motion a chain of events and a bitter political rivalry that would define South African politics for the next decade. The arms deal was a watershed moment. It was one of the first major post-apartheid corruption scandals, and it shattered the public's innocence. The trust between the people and their liberators began to erode. For many, it was shocking to think that the heroes of the struggle could be involved in something so cynical. The deal has been subject to multiple investigations over the years, including the Saridi Commission, which was widely criticized as a whitewash. To this day, the arms deal remains a symbol of the moment corruption took root in the new South Africa, with its full story still feeling like a murky, unresolved mystery. Making our way to number 4, we have another presidential departure, but this one was a political execution, not a slow bleed resignation. I'm talking about the ousting of President Thabo Mbeki in 2008. This was a political earthquake. Mbeki was an intellectual, a sophisticated statesman, often seen as the architect of South Africa's economic policies. He was a powerful, and some would say, aloof leader. The idea that he could be unceremoniously kicked out of office by his own party was, at the time, simply unthinkable. The backstory is pure political Shakespeare. It all goes back to his rivalry with Jacob Zuma. After Mbeki fired Zuma as deputy president in 2005 over the corruption allegations linked to the arms deal, the ANC split into two warring camps. It was Mbeki's intellectual technocratic camp versus Zuma's populist grassroots camp. This rivalry culminated in a dramatic showdown at the ANC's 52nd National Conference in Polokwane in December 2007. To the shock of many political analysts and the Mbeki camp itself, Jacob Zuma won the election for the ANC presidency. This created a bizarre and untenable situation. Mbeki was still the president of South Africa, but Zuma was now the president of the ruling party. It was like having two suns in the sky. The country had a president, but the power had decisively shifted to his greatest rival. Something had to give. The final blow came in September 2008. A High Court judge, Chris Nicholson, while dismissing corruption charges against Zuma, made a ruling that included a suggestion that there had been political interference in the prosecution, implying that Mbeki's office had meddled. This was all the ammunition the Zuma faction needed. The ANC's National Executive Committee, now packed with Zuma loyalists, met and made the shocking decision to recall President Mbeki. He was given an ultimatum: resign or be fired through a vote of no confidence in Parliament. With little choice, Mbeki announced his resignation in a televised address. It was a stunning fall from grace. The ousting of a sitting president by his own party was unprecedented and sent shockwaves through the political establishment. It led to a mass resignation of cabinet ministers loyal to Mbeki and even prompted the formation of a breakaway party, COPE. It was a brutal display of internal party power politics that fundamentally changed the ANC and the country. At number 3, we have a moment when the born-free generation, those born after the end of apartheid, found their voice and honestly shook the establishment to its core. This was the Fees Must Fall movement. It exploded onto the national scene in October 2015, starting as a student protest at Wits University against a proposed 10.5% tuition fee hike for the following year. But it quickly morphed into something much, much bigger. Within days, the protests spread like wildfire to universities across the country. This wasn't just a handful of students with placards, it was a massive, coordinated, and highly articulate national movement. Using social media to organize and get their message out, students shut down campuses from Cape Town to Johannesburg. Their central demand was simple and powerful: no fee increases and ultimately, free decolonized higher education for all. They argued that high fees were exclusionary and a barrier that perpetuated the inequalities of the apartheid era. The shocking part was the scale, speed, and intensity of it all. The country watched, captivated as students clashed with police. There were images of stun grenades being thrown on campuses, of students marching on the union buildings in Pretoria, and even storming the gates of Parliament in Cape Town, while the finance minister was delivering his budget speech. It was a level of youth-led activism that South Africa hadn't seen since the 1976 Soweto uprising. This movement put the government and university administrations in an impossible position. The students were not just protesting, they were fundamentally questioning the post-apartheid settlement. They were asking tough questions about decolonization, institutional racism, and economic inequality. They rejected the old guard of the ANC, arguing that the liberation movement had failed to deliver on its promises to the youth. It was a generational clash playing out in real time. The protests forced the government's hand. In a dramatic moment, President Zuma, after a long meeting with student leaders and university heads at the union buildings, came out and announced a 0% fee increase for 2016. It was a major victory for the students, but the movement didn't end there. It continued for years, evolving and raising even deeper questions. Fees Must Fall was a shocking wake-up call. A powerful demonstration that a new generation was no longer willing to wait patiently for change. They were demanding it now. For our runner-up, number 2, we look at a moment of profound personal and political drama that captivated and divided the nation. Winnie Madikizela Mandela's testimony before the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in 1997. The TRC was set up to help the country reckon with its brutal past. It was a space for victims to tell their stories, and for perpetrators to apply for amnesty by confessing their crimes. It was an emotionally grueling process for the entire country. Winnie Mandela, known as the mother of the nation, was a hero to many. While Nelson Mandela was in prison, she became the face of the internal resistance, a defiant and fearless symbol of the struggle. But her legacy was also controversial, particularly concerning the actions of the Mandela United Football Club, a group that acted as her personal bodyguards in Soweto in the 1980s. They were accused of numerous acts of violence, including kidnapping and murder, most famously, the killing of a 14-year-old activist named Stompie Sepe. The TRC convened a special hearing to investigate these allegations. For 9 days the nation was glued to the proceedings. Witness after witness came forward with harrowing testimony, accusing Winnie Mandela of personally ordering or participating in beatings and other abuses. The testimony was shocking and deeply damaging to her image as a flawless icon. Her supporters claimed it was a witch hunt, an attempt by her political enemies to destroy her. Her critics saw it as a necessary reckoning with a dark chapter of the struggle. The climax of the hearing was Winnie Mandela's own testimony. At first she was defiant, denying all the allegations and accusing her accusers of lying. The atmosphere was incredibly tense. The head of the TRC, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who was a personal friend, looked visibly pained. He pleaded with her, not as a judge, but as a father figure, to acknowledge that things went horribly wrong. He urged her to apologize for the sake of the nation's healing. In a stunning, dramatic moment, after immense pressure, she finally conceded. She admitted that things went horribly wrong and apologized to the family of Stompie Sepe and other victims. It was a reluctant, carefully worded apology, but it was an apology nonetheless. Archbishop Tutu was so overcome with emotion that he broke down in tears. It was a moment of raw, powerful, and deeply uncomfortable television. It didn't resolve the controversies around her, but it was a shocking and unforgettable piece of political theater that exposed the complex, messy, and often painful realities hidden beneath the grand narrative of the liberation struggle. And here we are, the #1 most shocking moment, or rather saga, in South African politics. It's a story that has everything: a president, a private palace, a swimming pool disguised as a firefighting tool, and a chicken run that costs more than most people's cars. Welcome, my friends, to the Nkandla Scandal. This scandal, more than any other, came to symbolize the perceived rot and impunity at the heart of the Zuma presidency. It was so absurd it would be funny if it weren't so infuriating. The story revolves around the security upgrades made to President Jacob Zuma's private rural homestead in Nkandla, KwaZulu-Natal. Now, presidents are entitled to state-funded security upgrades at their private homes. That's normal. What wasn't normal was the price tag, over 246 million rand, or about $23 million at the time. And what was even less normal was what this money was spent on. The list of security features included a visitors center, a cattle kraal, an amphitheater, and most famously, a swimming pool that was officially labeled a fire pool. The revelations, brought to light by the public protector, Thuli Madonsela, in her report Secure and Comfort, were met with a mixture of shock and ridicule. A fire pool? The entire country was asking the same question. How exactly does a swimming pool help fight a fire? Do the firefighters have to show up in their swimming trunks? The excuses became a national joke. The Minister of Police famously demonstrated in Parliament how the pool worked, explaining you could use a bucket to scoop out the water. The absurdity was off the charts. But the humor quickly gave way to deep anger. This was taxpayers' money being used to build a lavish private estate for the president, while millions of South Africans lived in poverty. It was a slap in the face. Zuma and his ministers denied any wrongdoing, insisting that all the features were for his security. The battle cry from opposition parties and civil society became "Pay back the money." It was chanted in Parliament, at protests, and became a viral meme. The Nkandla scandal dragged on for years, dominating the political landscape. It went all the way to the Constitutional Court, which delivered a landmark ruling that the president had failed to uphold, defend, and respect the Constitution by ignoring the public protector's remedial actions. It was a damning indictment. The scandal fundamentally eroded public trust, exposed the weakness of accountability mechanisms, and ultimately played a huge role in Zuma's downfall. For its sheer audacity, its long-running absurdity, and its profound constitutional impact, the Nkandla scandal has to be the most shocking political moment of South Africa's democratic era. And there you have it, 10 moments that define the beautiful, chaotic, and utterly compelling drama of South African politics. From the highest highs of Mandela's freedom walk to the lowest lows of state capture and corruption, it's been a roller coaster, to say the least. These events aren't just history, they are the building blocks of the country as it exists today. They've shaped its laws, its leaders, and the very psyche of its people. Each moment forced the nation to look in the mirror and ask some very difficult questions about what it stands for and where it's going. This list is, of course, subjective. It's just my take on the moments that sent the biggest shockwaves through the nation. Politics is personal, and what shocks one person might just be another Tuesday for someone else. That's the beauty of it. The story of South Africa is still being written, and if the past is anything to go by, the next chapter is bound to be just as dramatic and unpredictable. We've seen how quickly hope can turn to despair, and how, even in the darkest moments, the country finds a way to pull itself back from the brink. Now, I want to hear from you. Which of these moments shocked you the most? Did we miss anything? Was it the audacity of the Nkandla fire pool? The tragedy of Marikana? The sheer joy of Mandela's release? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I'll be reading through them. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into the wild world of politics, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because we have plenty more countdowns and analyses coming your way. Thanks for watching.